Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. So today we are exploring the ancient biblical narrative of God's ordered creation and the cosmic forces of rebellion that basically seek to tear it all down.
Right.
We're going to uncover how a snake is actually a rogue divine staff member, why Satan isn't actually a name, and how ancient warrior giants fit into this grand narrative about the spiritual forces of chaos forces that ultimately animate human corruption, greed, and the gods of money, sex, and military power.
Yeah, it's a massive paradigm shift. I mean, for anyone who grew up with that cartoonish imagery of, a red guy with a pitchfork sitting on your shoulder.
Like the little devil on your left side.
Exactly. The actual ancient texts present a framework that is infinitely more sophisticated and, frankly, far more unsettling.
Unsettling is definitely the word. We are about to deconstruct everything you thought you knew about the ancient concepts of good and evil.
Oh.
And real quick, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button, because today's mission is pretty ambitious.
It really is. We're taking a stack of source materials that dissect the biblical portrait of spiritual beings, and we're trying to pull out the core mechanics of how these authors actually understood the universe.
Yeah, our goal is to move past those cartoons. We want to deeply analyze this text's vision of a flourishing, ordered reality brought out of darkness, and the specific spiritual forces that are just bent on dragging it all back to chaos.
Which is exactly why this material is so compelling, The authors of these texts were not just writing spooky folklore to scare children.
Right. It wasn't just ancient horror stories.
No, not at all. They were grappling with the mechanics of systemic evil. They were looking at a broken world filled with disease, war, oppression, and they were trying to articulate the root cause.
They fundamentally refuse to believe that the world is naturally supposed to be this way.
Exactly. And they also refuse to just blame it all on bad human behavior.
Which is the lens I want you, the listener, to use today. Whether you approach this as theology, as ancient history, or just simply as brilliant literature, you are getting a masterclass in how early thinkers understood the roots of institutional corruption and human suffering.
Absolutely. But to understand the rebellion, we first have to understand the order it disrupted, right?
Right. The material takes us right to page 1, Genesis 1.
Yeah, you literally cannot understand the biblical concept of evil without first grasping what the text considers to be good. In the ancient Near Eastern mindset, the opposite of creation wasn't nothingness.
It was chaos, right?
Exactly. It was a dark, raging, formless ocean. So in Genesis 1, God doesn't just materialize objects out of thin air. He actively pushes back the dark chaos and brings about a highly structured, beautiful, ordered reality.
And the entire purpose of this order is to create an environment where life can flourish. He builds this temple-like cosmos, and then he appoints humans as his representatives to rule over it.
Right, and the text establishes this incredible rhythm. It has God declare the creation good 7 distinct times.
It builds a baseline of perfect order, beauty, truth, and generosity. Basically, everything is functioning exactly as designed. But then you turn the page to Genesis 3, and the rhythm violently stops.
It's so abrupt. We are introduced to a creature that is already in a state of active rebellion against the Creator.
And the text doesn't even pause to give us this creature's backstory, does it?
No, it doesn't explain the origins of its descent at all right there. Its motive, however, is glaringly obvious. It wants to ruin this ordered, flourishing world for the other creatures. This is the foundational portrait of evil in the narrative.
And it shows up as a slithering snake, which, always felt like a weirdly specific, almost random choice for the ultimate villain.
Right. It seems bizarre to a modern reader.
But understanding the ancient context totally changes the reading. First off, Eden isn't described as just a community garden. It's a high place, like a cosmic mountain. It represents a unique space where the earthly realm and the heavenly realm completely overlap.
And that geographical overlap is critical. It implies that the beings inhabiting this space aren't just terrestrial wildlife. We are dealing with entities that cross over from the divine sphere.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, and later biblical authors actually flesh out the imagery that Genesis leaves somewhat ambiguous. For instance, when the prophet Isaiah describes his vision of God's heavenly throne room, he sees spiritual beings surrounding the Creator, acting as divine attendants or guardians.
And he calls them the seraphim.
Exactly.
Which in Hebrew, seraphim translates literally to burning ones or snakes. So we aren't talking about a garden variety reptile that suddenly learned Hebrew.
No, definitely not.
We are talking about a spiritual being, a divine guardian, essentially a former high-ranking staff member in God's throne room.
Spot on. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, serpentine figures were frequently associated with divine wisdom, eternal life, and guarding the thrones of kings or gods.
So the original audience would have immediately recognized this figure.
Oh, without a doubt. Not as a talking zoo animal, but as a powerful, brilliant spiritual entity that had access to the divine council.
I have to throw an analogy in here because thinking about this dynamically really helps ground the concept.
Go for it.
It's like looking at a perfectly run multinational corporation. Suddenly, a high-ranking executive board member goes completely rogue. But he knows he doesn't have the power to just fire the CEO, in this case, God.
Right. He can't win a direct fight.
Exactly.
Mm.
So instead, he goes down to the factory floor and corners the newly hired middle managers, which would be humanity. He convinces them to toss out the company handbook and start running the heavy machinery based on their own gut instincts.
Which is a terrible idea.
Right. The rogue executive knows this will inevitably cause the machines to explode and destroy the factory. That is the actual goal. But my question is, why does the text have him tempt Adam and Eve with the exact same desire ruling by their own wisdom rather than just attacking them?
That captures the mechanics of the temptation perfectly. And the prophet Ezekiel gives us a look at the psychology behind it. He describes this figure as a rebel who became enamored with his own beauty and wisdom.
So an ego thing.
A massive ego trip. He fundamentally refused to live under the Creator's authority anymore. He didn't just want to serve in the throne room, he wanted to sit on the throne.
But since he can't win a direct power struggle with the architect of the universe, he initiates a proxy war. He targets the humans.
Exactly. And what is brilliant about the narrative is the specific lie he uses. He doesn't tell Adam and Eve to become evil or to worship him.
Right. He tempts them with the exact same ideology that caused his own fall, the desire for total autonomy. He tells them they can seize divine wisdom for themselves and to find good and evil on their own terms.
It is an ideological recruitment.
Yeah.
By convincing humanity to reach for that autonomy, the rebel successfully recruits them into his own spiritual insurrection.
He tricks them into thinking that independence from God is freedom.
When in reality, it is severing the cord from the only source of life. The tragic result is that both parties face exile. The humans lose their access to the overlapping space of Eden, and the divine rebel is degraded, symbolically cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust.
Basically, they are completely stripped of their former heavenly status. And from that moment forward in the literature, human rebellion and spiritual rebellion are permanently intertwined.
Yeah, they are locked in a destructive partnership that constantly pulls the ordered world back toward the dark chaos of Genesis 1.
So if we are dealing with a fallen divine being rather than a literal snake, we really need to clarify who this entity actually is. Because to understand the rest of the text, we have to strip away centuries of cultural baggage and look at the actual titles used by the ancient authors.
The terminology is fascinating because the authors are remarkably consistent in describing his function rather than giving him a proper name.
Right. Throughout the text, this entity is depicted using a variety of chaotic images.
Yeah. Sometimes he is the snake, other times he is depicted as a churning sea dragon, a creature of the dark desert wastes, or, the shadowy king of the grave.
And his titles reflect a singular destructive purpose. He is called the Tempter, or the Evil One. In the Greek text, the title is Diabolos, or the Devil, which literally means the slanderer, someone who tears down reality through lies.
But the title that absolutely dominates our modern consciousness is Satan.
Yeah, and I think it will shock a lot of people to learn that, biblically speaking, Satan is not a name.
No, not at all. It is entirely a title. In the original Hebrew language, the word almost always appears with a definite article attached.
Just Satan, right.
Exactly, ha-Satan, which translates directly to the adversary. It functions like a job description, similar to saying the prosecutor or the opponent.
That reframes the entire concept. I mean, we have this ingrained image of a guy whose driver's license literally says first name, Satan, last name, Devil. But if he is just an adversarial force, a cosmic opposer, how does that actually operate in the physical world? The analysis points out that this being is essentially anti-everything. My question is, how can an entity build an opposing kingdom if it doesn't actually stand for anything positive?
Well, that brings us to the most terrifying characteristic of the biblical portrait of evil. It is fundamentally parasitic.
Parasitic, like a virus.
Think about how a biological virus operates. A virus is not technically a living organism capable of generating its own energy or reproducing independently. It requires a healthy host cell.
It hijacks the host's machinery to replicate itself, and in the process, destroys the host.
Yes. The adversary operates the exact same way. He possesses no creative power. He cannot speak a universe into existence. He cannot generate beauty, truth, or order.
So he just cannibalizes what is already there. He takes the good creation and twists it.
Precisely. His entire methodology relies on deceit and slander. He doesn't have a competing master plan for a better alternative universe.
Right. His solitary objective is just to drag humanity and creation back into the primordial darkness. It is an agenda of pure decay.
Which is far more chilling than a guy with horns, honestly. The enemy isn't a rival king with a different flag. The enemy is the very concept of distortion and death.
Okay, but as we move forward in the texts, we see that this parasitic adversary isn't operating in isolation.
No, he's not.
There is a deeply weird section in the ancient writings showing that this spiritual rebellion happened in waves, and those waves crashed directly into human history.
Right. We are referring to Genesis chapter 6, which reintroduces the concept of the divine council, or the sons of God, which was the ancient term for the spiritual beings comprising God's heavenly staff.
The text states that a faction of these beings also rebelled, descending to earth and intermingling with human women.
Which results in the birth of the Nephilim. The text describes them as violent warrior giants of ancient renown.
Now we have to pause here, because to a modern reader, this sounds like the text suddenly took a hard left turn into Lord of the Rings.
Oh, it completely feels like pure myth.
How on earth did the original audience process this?
Well, to understand it, you have to place yourself in the shoes of an ancient Israelite. You have to look at the geographical and historical context. The Israelites were surrounded by massive militaristic empires, like Babylon and Egypt.
Right.
These rival kingdoms possessed elaborate mythologies, claiming that their societies were founded by giant, part-divine warrior kings. For example, Mesopotamian literature is full of the Apkallu, these demigod figures who supposedly brought advanced divine knowledge from the heavens to build great cities and weapons of war.
And the neighboring empires literally worshipped these figures. They viewed their tyrannical, conquering kings as the pinnacle of human and divine achievement.
So when the authors of Genesis 6 write about the sons of God and the Nephilim, they are directly engaging with those cultural tropes, but they are completely subverting them.
It is brilliant ancient counter-propaganda. The biblical authors are looking at the sacred texts of their oppressors, texts that glorify these part-divine warrior kings, and they are saying, oh, you think your founders are glorious demigods who should be worshipped?
Let me tell you their real origin story.
Right. They are the Nephilim. They aren't heroes. They are cosmic mistakes. They are the illegitimate offspring of a spiritual rebellion, and they are entirely captive to evil.
And the psychological impact of that narrative on an oppressed people would have been immense. It strips the divine mandate away from tyrants.
It firmly asserts that these celebrated warrior kings are not agents of divine order.
No, they are agents of chaos who fill God's good world with blood and violence.
And the text immediately grounds this in a specific example in Genesis 10 with a king named Nimrod. The literature notes that his name literally sounds like the Hebrew verb to rebel.
Right. Nimrod is credited with founding the city of Babylon, and Babylon becomes the ultimate enduring symbol of human arrogance in the biblical narrative.
It is the pinnacle of humans trying to build a tower to the heavens to usurp God's authority, utilizing the very violence and oppression modeled by the Nephilim.
While God ultimately scatters the builders of Babylon, the spiritual fallout of that event sets the stage for the rest of history. Much later in the text, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses looks back at the Babylon event and provides a theological commentary on the aftermath.
What does he say?
He states that God essentially handed the rebellious nations over to worship the corrupt host of heaven. And Moses introduces a very specific term for these lesser spiritual beings. He calls them demons.
Wow. This is another moment where we have to completely jettison our modern pop culture conditioning. Because when we hear the word demon, we think of horror movies, poltergeists, or, a girl spinning her head around in a bedroom.
Yeah, the Exorcist stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the ancient framework defines demons in a radically different and arguably much more dangerous way. They are identified as the spiritual forces operating behind corrupt human power structures.
They are the animating spirits of institutionalized evil. The texts specifically associate these entities with the driving forces of empire. They are the gods of money, sex, and military power.
They demand human sacrifice, whether literally in ancient times or metaphorically through the meat grinder of endless war and economic exploitation.
That totally reframes how we look at systemic issues, doesn't it? We usually think of a corrupt military-industrial complex as just a bunch of greedy politicians in a room.
But this framework suggests there is an actual animating spiritual force that feeds off that specific type of destruction. These demons operate on a macro level, fueling the violence of empires like Babylon or Rome.
Yet the authors are careful to note that these forces also operate on a deeply microscopic level. They exploit the inherent weaknesses of mortal bodies.
Right. They animate the everyday greed, the petty selfishness, and the interpersonal division that tears communities apart.
The macro-level tyranny of an empire and the micro-level greed of an individual are powered by the exact same parasitic spiritual rebellion.
It is all part of this singular effort by the adversary to unravel creation. Which brings us to the climax of this entire narrative framework. Centuries later, Jesus arrives on the scene.
And if you read the historical accounts of his life, his worldview is entirely 100% shaped by this specific cosmic conflict.
It dictates his entire mission. The Jewish people at the time were largely expecting a political messiah who would violently overthrow the Roman Empire. But Jesus completely ignores Rome as the ultimate villain.
He and his earliest followers looked at the disease, the oppression, and the madness in the world, and they didn't just see bad luck or bad politicians. They saw humanity held hostage.
They viewed human suffering as a symptom of the world's captivity to the adversary, and that realization radically shifts the battlefield.
Absolutely. If your worldview dictates that your primary enemy is the Roman Empire, you start a bloody political revolt. You fight flesh and blood.
But Jesus' approach shifts the war entirely toward fighting invisible systems of death. In his eyes, the people carrying out the oppression aren't the ultimate enemy.
No, they are just deeply deceived captives of a dark spiritual architecture. And therefore, you cannot save humanity by just swapping out one human king for another.
Right, a political band-aid will not cure a terminal spiritual sickness.
Jesus viewed his mission not as a political revolution, but as a cosmic rescue operation. To free humanity from the grip of the adversary, he had to confront the very power of death itself.
He allowed the forces of chaos to expend all their ammunition on him, dying at the hands of the Roman and religious establishments in order to break their power from the inside out.
It is a stunning, cohesive vision.
It really is. Let's recap the journey we've taken today. We started with the absolute beauty of God's Genesis creation, a reality painstakingly ordered out of chaos so that life could flourish.
And we saw that order hijacked by a rogue member of the divine staff, a serpentine guardian who wanted the throne and recruited humanity into a proxy war for autonomy.
We deconstructed the myth of Satan as a horned monster, revealing instead the adversary, a terrifyingly parasitic force that cannot create but only distorts reality through slander and division.
We explored the genius counter-propaganda of the ancient authors who looked at the revered demigods of rival empires and exposed them as the Nephilim violent pawns of a spiritual rebellion.
And we traced how that rebellion formalized into the concept of demons, the systemic, spiritual drivers of money, sex, and military power that animate institutional greed, which Jesus ultimately came to dismantle.
It provides a profound, unified lens for understanding the true nature of the battle taking place in the world.
And that is exactly why this ancient text is so relevant to you right now. When you open an app and look at the news, when you see the endless grinding cycles of hatred, the societal fractures, the institutional greed that seems entirely immune to reform, this framework offers a way to understand it.
It suggests that humanity isn't just naturally doomed to destroy itself.
Rather, we are caught in the crossfire of a much older, much deeper war between ordered life and parasitic chaos.
And as we close, it leaves us with a compelling thought to mull over. The ancient texts insisted that natures were heavily influenced by spiritual principalities, invisible powers that demanded devotion and drove human behavior toward chaos.
Right.
Today, we might not use the word demon, but we are increasingly governed by massive, disembodied algorithms and tech platforms. These invisible systems feed on human outrage, stoke division, and seem to operate with a destructive life of their own that even their creators can't fully control.
That's a terrifying thought.
We have to ask, are these disembodied systems simply the modern incarnation of those ancient principalities, doing the exact same work of the adversary under a 21st century disguise?